Welcome back to our series with Michael Horner. And we've been looking at some of the question is why does Christianity have a bad reputation today in today's culture? Or why is at least there are stories being spread about Christianity that paint it in a very bad light and not good for culture? So we've been looking at these things and have found that the actual historical track record is vastly different, is significantly different than what is being promoted all the time. No, that does not mean that there have not been negative things that people who are probably would claim to be devout Christians and genuinely, thought they were, and maybe really are. It has not. There have been those things too, and so we started off by looking at the positive contribution that Christianity has made to history today, and it's the bottom line is that when you weigh the negative and the positive substantially outweighs the negative. But we did need to look at the negative ones, and so for the last few episodes, we have been looking at these negative things: Christianity in Galileo, Christianity in the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the last episode we started looking at the witches and the track of what's being promoted as Christianity's response to the witches, the witch trials, witch burnings, and so forth. So we had a good start on it last week, but it is probably the most complex issue that we need to look at here. And Michael has done an enormous amount of research and reading on this topic. And so we had to do 2 episodes on the witches, and today is this part 2 of the witches. If you missed part 1, you'll want to hear that. And so I'd recommend listening to that first and then this second episode. And this will be the last episode where we look at some of the negative blemishes on Christianity, when we look back in history. And then the next episode, Michael wants to take a look at, well, okay, this is what Christianity's track record is in history, but how does that compare with non-religious and so forth? So Michael will be looking at that starting in episode 10. But for now, we're back. And how are you doing, Michael?
Doing great. Looking forward to today's time together.
Me too. I am really enjoying this, like what you're covering with each of these different topics. And when I got a preview of what you're going to be talking about today, it's fascinating. It's new territory for me, and I think for about 98% of our listeners, if not all of them, it'll be new, groundbreaking material for them. It's out there. The historical record is out there, but often we just hear the popular memes and statements being made without actually knowing what history has to say on this. So why don't you take it away, Michael, and talk about part 2 of witches.
All right. Well, we ended part 1 by pointing out that the end of the witch trial period in history came about as a result of the Inquisition. The Inquisition's positive input that there really were no witches, and that these people who are claiming to be or involved in this sort of magic type stuff, need to be treated differently than the way they had been treated. And it was only 100 years later that Enlightenment thinkers began to make a change in their views on this. And so it's the Enlightenment narrative that the Enlightenment put it into just isn't correct. It actually started with the church, and then Protestants picked up on it, and then the Enlightenment group. But we didn't get a chance to go into the causes, like what actually caused these witch trials and witch executions. And this is a very difficult question that, as far as I can tell, nobody's really come up with a definitive answer. One scholar that has done a really good job summarizing the different theories of causation is a man named Brian Pavlak. And you can look at his stuff at brianpavlak.org. And here's what Pavlak says. Historians are still trying to explain the reasons for this great variety in witch hunting. Important factors could have been the power of the central government, the independence of local authorities, tensions created by war, failing economies or famine, and uncertainties about religious conformity. But the bigger question is why the authorities would consider the witches a danger as opposed to traditional scapegoats like Jews, heretics, homosexuals, foreigners, or even sorcerers. Specific hunts were often rooted in specific local circumstances, he says. Still, historians have tried to come up with general explanations for this complex phenomenon of witch hunts. And here's his caution. One should be wary of any author who suggests one cause for all the witch hunts. He says, I discern 10 general trends that some historians have tried to argue as causes for the witch hunts. And you can access this on his website. So let's look at these 10 general trends that he says historians have put forward as possible causes for the witch hunts. The first category he calls illness theories. Illness theories. And these are variously related to physical and mental conditions of people involved in the hunts. And so he's got 4 categories here of illness theories. Mass hysteria theory. Maybe the peasants just went a little wacky, becoming clinically neurotic and even psychotic, and in a group panic went after the witches. Or delusion theory, giving credence to children's fantasies and psychosomatic illnesses are some sources for the panic, maybe. Or disease theory, suggests syphilis or ergotism caused by mold or rotten bread as causes for mental instability. And then the last illness theory he suggests is drug theory. Suggests the effects of consuming bad mushrooms, herbs like deadly nightshade or enbrain or bufotenine or the skin of some toads could have affected people's minds. Now, in each of these 10 causes, Pavlik describes them, and then he basically shows why they are not adequate to be a good explanation for it. So for the illness theories, he says, but it's hard to explain how so many people, even in one area, could become seriously ill or disturbed all at once. Additionally, an important characteristic of the witch hunts were their systematic organization by ruling elites and government officials, not some chaotic outbreak. And so he dismisses this as a adequate cause for everything. But he'll basically say there may be a little bit of something to each one of these. The second one, the geographic origins theory. He says the witch hunts originated in specific locations. For example, first in the mountainous regions of the Alps and the Pyrenees, or out of economic differentiation between regions which were normally self-sufficient and suddenly caught in a new competition because of commercial revolution. So that's the geographic origins theories. But Pavlik says, but these explanations are contradicted by counterexamples. Regions where the lowlands first hunted and then it spread to the hills, or the difficulty of quantifying economic differences. But in my view, this might explain some of the causation. Thirdly, the disaster theory. As actual misfortune struck, where plague, famine, war, storm, people blamed supernatural forces and found scapegoats in witches. But, Pavlik says, many persecutions were done during times of relative peace and plenty. Further, many such troubles were not new to early modern Europe, but have been endemic throughout history. Thus, why were witches to blame, not other common scapegoats? He says Jews, sodomites, deviants, foreigners, or other supernatural forces, such as demons without the aid of human witches. Why do you get human witches involved here? Fourthly, he lists the greed theory. This is the theory that elites initiated the hunts in order to confiscate the property of others. But, he says, many persecuted people did not have much wealth, and in many hunts, property was not confiscated, even from very wealthy targets. So that doesn't explain much. 5, the mistaken conspiracy theory. Through most of the Middle Ages, demons and witches were insignificant to the Christian belief system. Then in the late Middle Ages, religious elites in Western Europe created a new and mistaken intellectual framework out of Christian heresy and theology concerning demons. They linked the idea of witches to an imagined organized sect, which was a danger to the Christian commonwealth. So goes this theory. Thus, authorities sincerely believed in and acted against this satanic threat, even though it did not really exist, according to most theologians, before and after, as well as many during the time period. And I would point out that this seems to be Rodney Stark's view that I'd mentioned last week, although Stark leaves out the conspiracy part of the existence of an organized group. But, Pavlik says, how could a rather minor idea with so little supporting evidence lead to such enormous efforts by so many people, especially those with little to gain? In other words, how did an intellectual fashion move so many to physical action? Now, my addition here is that Stark's explanation that we went over last week of the reasoning process that took place, based on Christianity's emphasis on the use of reason. Stark's explanation was God and saints were viewed as causes for successful church magic, and evil beings as causes for successful non-church magic. That does seem to me to be cogent and capable of capturing people's minds and passions, and so maybe there's something to that, but I do think Pavlik is correct that it doesn't explain all that happened with the witch trials. Number 6, the religious rebellion theories. Now, these theories are of two kinds. First, the satanic religious rebellion theory, where devil worship actually existed, in particular as a subversive attack on the ruling Christian order. Early historians of witchcraft, such as Jules Michelet or Montague Summers, take the tortured confessions of witches at their word. Pavlik says, but no credible evidence supports the existence of any actual satanic cults before the 19th century. The second type of religious rebellion theory he calls the pagan religious rebellion theory, where certain forms of worship from the ancient world continued through the early modern period and was misinterpreted by the Christian hunters as satanic. And this theory was formulated by the folklorist Margaret Murray. She said the worship of the horn god Janus or Dianus was the focus of pagan continuity into modern times. So this thing could be called the Murrayite theory, and it's popular even today in neo-pagan circles. But Pavlik says, but there's no credible evidence that reveals the survival of much paganism or any organized fertility cults beyond just common superstition and simple folk traditions. So professional scholars have largely discredited Murray's work. Number 7, the confessional conflict theory. The Reformation and its resultant fights between Protestants, mainly Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists, as well as Anglicans and Roman Catholics, led each to use witchcraft to attack one another. So, in my view, this means witches were hunted to show that their group, Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anglican, were more serious about and effective at curtailing this evil and dangerous plague of witches, and thus to attract people to join their group. So there's two ways this could be done. The attack one, you use it to attack other people as being other denominations being the cause of the witches, and the other is to attract other people because you're showing yourself to be more committed and effective at getting rid of this danger. But Pavlik says, but adherents of one branch of Christianity only rarely use the accusation of witchcraft specifically to persecute someone of another branch. Usually the witch hunts were carried out by people of the same type of Christianity as the victims. So that one doesn't quite explain very much either. Maybe a bit, but not everything. Number 8, the social control or state building theory. Early modern governments exploited the fear of witchcraft in order to centralize authority, increase bureaucratic jurisdiction, impose cultural uniformity, and dominate the church. The hierarchy may have believed in witchcraft or not, but a dangerous conspiracy provided the premise for expanding government intervention. By the way, this sounds extremely contemporary, if you catch my drift. This theory has a certain similarity to the church oppression theory, popular in the 19th century, but held by few people today, according to which the church fraudulently invented witches so as to crush its opponents and grow rich. But Pavlik says, but why should witchcraft be the specific target in these years? And why should the hunts be so vicious and as a result cause such disturbances in the state? And the theory gives too much credit to the elites over the ignorant masses. Number 9, the social functionalist or social accusations theory. Witch accusers acted on a psychological need to blame others for their own personal problems. Witch hunts were therapeutically beneficial for society in this theory, since they defined what was right and wrong and rid society of its troublesome, marginalized folk, the old and the poor. Thus, the hunts functioned to reinforce and define social boundaries of moral and acceptable behavior. But Pavlik says these theories do not take into account motives of individual accusations, such as local feuds and grudges, and contemporary explanations of those involved, the religious and political context. And why should the hunts be so vicious? And again, why should witchcraft be the specific target in these years? Again, does not seem to be an adequate explanation. And number 10, the last theory that Pavlik says has been put out there by historians, the misogyny theory. The witch hunts embodied a social hostility towards women. But the majority of accused and executed were female, according to this theory, yet also old, living alone, whether widowed or spinster, and poor. Pavlik says, but such theories exaggerate the proportions of women involved and the extent to which women were the focus. I think my research shows that the women were the majority, but it wasn't entirely the case. Men in some witch hunts were the majority of victims, and some hunts persecuted children of both sexes. So all that can be found on Brian Pavlik's 10 Theories about the Origins of the Witch Hunts on Brian Pavlik, Pavlak, PAVLAC.org, under witch hunts. So maybe none of these 10 theories alone can adequately explain the witch hunts, but perhaps it's a combination of some or all of these theories that can provide some reasonable explanation. But the real issue that we want to discuss here, Kirk, was biblical teaching the cause? Was this the result of the teachings of Jesus and his followers? And notice that Pavlik does not list biblical teachings as one of the causes. Probably because the church wasn't appealing to Scripture. Even though there are some scriptural texts that they could appeal to. But historically, scriptural texts did not seem to be influential. And conceivably, some passages like Old Testament theocratic injunctions for capital punishment for sorcerers, and New Testament teaching that sorcerers were among those who would not inherit the kingdom of heaven, those could have contributed to the witch trials and executions, presumably, but there's little evidence that these passages were the driving force behind the witch hunts, let alone even in the minds of those involved in the church hierarchy and scholars, or even the heresy hunters of the Inquisition. We saw last week that for the most part, the church didn't even believe that there really was such a thing as witches. Moreover, the witch hunts were not the proper understanding and application of those biblical texts. So, even though we can imagine that they could have influenced the witch craze, they apparently did not. So, what was happening here? All right, I'm going to try, from my perspective, based on what I've looked at in my research, to provide something helpful here. First of all, the practice of magic was going on. There was pagan thinking about the gods controlling nature, and that there's power in words and incantations. And the church was doing it too. They just kind of had a religious Catholic cloak to it all. So, there's still that type of thinking going on, and it still exists in our world today. There's stories of missionaries, especially in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in South America, where, pagan views of the spirit world and what they can do in the world are very much alive. And so then the desire to explain this, how do you explain this apparent magic that seems to work sometimes? The susceptibility of people to be paranoid of what they don't understand, I think, is just part of human nature. Can happen to anybody in any situation. And then specifically within the church context, within the Christian context, there was a lack of application or poor application of the Bible. That is, the Bible's teachings on the imago Dei. That is the view that human beings are created in the image of God, and we are supposed to love our neighbors, and Jesus said, love our enemies. Also, the Bible's teachings on the fallenness of human beings, which would mean people with a human nature have a propensity to lie and to do what's best for themselves, even when it might hurt others. It seemed that there just was a lack of application of these biblical preaching. So it wasn't the application of biblical teaching; it may have been the fact that people were not applying the Bible that was more the problem. A poor understanding of testimony and just discernment of whether people are telling truth versus lies. Canon law had been developed a few hundred years before this, and so there was progress being made in culture about how law and courts should function, but it just hadn't moved far enough, apparently. Also, poor recognition of other factors that may have contributed to people telling lies and accusing others. Why are these people telling lies and accusing others? And maybe that's where you get into famines and economic factors, and it's human nature taking over to make their enemies look bad because they're afraid for their families and afraid for their own future and afraid of being poor and starving. And that would be understandable. You can also have wild accusations by children that were accepted by adults far too readily, it seemed. That would be one other potential cause. Treating people as outsiders contrary to the biblical teaching of loving your enemies. There was also the fact that jurors were often related to the accusers. Now that's a problem, right? You know, if Joe's being accused, but his cousin's on the jury, it might go a little better for him. And then Christians just following their sinful natures and the cultural teaching of suspicion of and power over the other. One of the things that I've discovered as I'm looking through these negative consequences is that there's always some truth to these stories, exaggerated as they are. Yes, some Christians did bad things, and Christians can and still do bad things because God leaves us our free will even after we are redeemed, forgiven for our sins, and indwelt by the Holy Spirit. We can choose to take control of our own life and not allow him to be the Lord of our life today and tomorrow and the next day, or for however long, and fall back into following our sinful natures. The temptations come from our culture as well as ourselves and the devil, and treating other people with less than the dignity they deserve as people created in the image of God. So the problem isn't belief in the supernatural. See, that's the Enlightenment explanation for this. The problem is superstition and belief in the supernatural. That's what superstition is. And in particular, belief in evil supernatural beings. The problem is more in the reasoning and the paranoia that led to the hysteria, the false accusations, and the abandonment of love, charity, grace, careful reasoning, careful checks and balances in the whole trial procedures. So this phrase kind of sums up my view here. Belief in the supernatural may be a necessary condition for belief in witches, but it is not a sufficient condition.
I can see it. What you've said here, Michael, makes a lot of sense to me when I even think back, first of all, to my childhood in grade school, elementary school. There were certain students, certain children who were different. It was, who defines what that particular difference is? But then they start becoming ostracized and bullied and pushed around and shunned, actually. Not in a religious sense, but just, you stay away. If you don't want to be laughed at, you don't do anything to those people. And thankfully the adults, they stepped in and they tried to direct the children's thinking on this. But later on, I saw that similar things happen in communities. And I know specific examples where adults in some particular community will begin to, and it's mainly because some family in the community or some person who lives by themselves, thought to be a little eccentric or whatever, they might not invoke some supernatural thing, but they start becoming ostracized by that community. And I can see that sometimes people will use, it's not that religion drives this, but rather they appeal or they try and justify their prejudices and their hostility towards somebody by putting a religious garment around it. For example, this person is a witch and therefore evil and doing all these, but it's not because they got that teaching in Sunday from the minister. It was because they had these innate prejudice, which is not unique to religious people by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
And then they look to something credible to justify it. People often try and justify their actions by appealing to something that's held to have some credibility in the community, whether it's religion, national security, whatever it might be. So I can see a lot of these factors coming into play, not any one in particular, but yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Very good point. And so I just want to emphasize that it wasn't the teaching of Christianity or the Bible in particular that led to the witch trials, but it was things like careless reasoning, fear, paranoia, hysteria, faulty legal procedure, and the absence of application of Christian principles that led to the execution of 40,000 plus people accused of being witches, and mostly, not all, but mostly women. And in fact, Christian principles that evolved in the Middle Ages, if they had been applied properly, could have prevented the witch executions, like careful reasoning process designed to get at the truth of the matter, that also protects the human rights of both the accused and the accuser, acknowledges both the imago Dei and human fallenness, with all involved innocent until proven guilty. So the real problem here is not witchcraft, for it seems unlikely that real witches were knowingly invoking evil spirits, as the Inquisition concluded. That was the Inquisition's conclusion on this. This is misguided attempts to protect people and societies from harm by demonizing others and blaming others for misfortune that has no obvious cause, falsely accusing them, and ignoring the biblical principles like the imago Dei in all people, the importance of telling truth, fallenness of all people, which requires that truth telling must be carefully monitored because we're all fallen and flawed, and especially with children in their immaturity, and that people's innocence should be protected from false accusations. So it's not about sorcery and witchcraft, but it's about lies, deception, stealing people's property, violence towards others through scapegoating, groupthink, and hysteria. And if there was any demonic activity, it was probably, and ironically and sadly, not so much in the people who were accused of being witches as it was with the accusers, who were far too quick to accuse others, often women and people of low social standing, of being in league with Satan, and those who got caught up in the hysteria of the web of lies. I mean, Satan is called the great accuser. I mean, I could easily see how this could be part of his playbook in such an ironic and twisted fashion.
Yeah. People just tend to think that Satan would be interested in causing bad people to do bad things. But if in fact this is all true, like Jesus Christ is God, the Savior of those who put their faith in him, and there is a group of people who follow Jesus Christ, it would seem very reasonable to conclude that Satan's ultimate target, or his most priority target, would actually be to try and discredit the church by inciting them or moving them, or inciting people who would publicly be known as Christians to do wrong things. But it doesn't logically follow, therefore, that that's what Jesus taught. And that's something you've brought out time and time again, is I always ask the question, is this what Jesus taught?
Yeah.
Or is this, and it has been remarkably successful in discrediting, when you look at culture today, discrediting whatever Christianity is, and most people aren't even clear on what that is. They would call it a religion, but it's a broad spectrum, and only part of that spectrum is actually following Christ. But it has to do with, is that what Jesus actually taught, or is this a deception of that's promoted by Satan against the church, or getting them to do things to discredit themselves? And that's a major coup if the church or Christianity can be moved to discredit itself.
So I want to repeat the sort of summary statement I said a few minutes ago, that belief in the supernatural may be a necessary condition for belief in witches, but it is not a sufficient condition. Now, that statement I can see being picked up by a non-theist, an atheist, an agnostic, and say, oh, yeah, okay, it's a necessary condition, and therefore we need to get rid of that necessary condition, and you're going to get rid of witchcraft. Um, and I want to evaluate that Enlightenment narrative that anti supernaturalism gets rid of superstition, and therefore that is a good thing to do, to have an anti supernatural bias. And in fact, that's what got rid of the witch trials. And we've already seen historically that that's not the case. That's not what got rid of witch trials. In fact, witch trials didn't happen in the Dark Ages, we saw last week. They happened in the early modern period while Enlightenment thinkers were around and influential. And it was the church inquisitors who actually planted the seeds for the demise of witchcraft. But let's look at this idea of eliminating belief in the supernatural. So, eliminating belief in the supernatural and claiming that this is the solution to witch trials, even if it would be pragmatically successful, I suggest it's a case of overkill that overlooks the sufficient conditions, that is, the more relevant causes, and plausibly maybe causing other harms and eliminating other positive benefits of belief in the supernatural. So it's a classic case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Even though you really did get rid of the dirty bathwater, you got rid of something way more valuable.
Yeah, just to clarify that, Michael, I have a couple of peer-reviewed papers published in journals, peer-reviewed journals that look at the pro-social benefits of religious belief, particularly Christian religious belief. And so, as you're saying there, to stomp out all religious belief, as say that some of the communist countries tried to do in the 1900s, actually stomps out a major, significant, and powerful pro-social benefit in that society. So it is a case of in an effort to stomp this out, say witch trials, you actually destroy the pro-social, prime pro-social motivator within that community. The other thing is that it's the problem of scapegoating that you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned various peoples and people groups that were tended to be scapegoats for bad things happening. And so maybe stomping out superstitious belief might put an end to witch trials, but would it protect those people that are already that will it protect the people who are already being ostracized and looked down, and the scapegoats of a society? In other words, wouldn't we see other reasons being brought forward
Right.
to incriminate and penalize individuals within? You look at some of the communist countries and some of the purges that were done there, particularly in Cambodia and during the Cultural Revolution in China. Wow, you just have a painting in your house, a nice classic painting, and that could be the death sentence for you. So, and there was no superstition in there. They had the whole different, there were other reasons. And the bottom line is, what about the scapegoats or people being scapegoated? Probably wouldn't protect them. It just
Very good point.
jumping from the frying pan into the fire, or moving one excuse to the side and using a different excuse instead.
Right. Is it possible to get links to those articles that our viewers could access
Yeah, I
them?
would have. Yeah, I'll have to take. I have probably 1,000 papers on my computer, and most of them are sorted. Well, half are sorted. A few hundred aren't. But I think I've got that one on my computer, and I'll just see if we can put a link or two in the description below to some of them.
All right, so let's actually look at this philosophically here from the point of view of logic. The strategy of doubting everything versus believing everything. And I'm going to show what happens if we go to either one of those extremes. So, anti-supernaturalism, that is, disbelieving all statements about the supernatural, will eliminate belief in witches and Satan, but it will also eliminate belief in God and miracles. Well, what about the other extreme? let's believe all statements about the supernatural. Well, believing all statements about the supernatural entails believing all true and false statements about the supernatural. And believing all false supernatural statements is a great epistemological cost for the benefit of believing all the true ones. So it looks like neither extreme, doubting everything or disbelieving everything, every supernatural belief, or believing every supernatural statement, is a good strategy. Neither believing or disbelieving all supernatural statements is a good epistemological strategy. Rather, supernatural claims require careful investigation and reasoning based on all available data. Anti supernaturalism, which I'm suggesting is the Enlightenment strategy, has been anti supernaturalism doesn't do that. It decides prior to investigation and analysis that there is no supernatural. The Inquisitors, in contrast, did not begin with any anti supernaturalism. They evaluated the evidence and determined that these people aren't really witches. Now, this idea of anti supernaturalism or believing all supernatural beliefs is analogous to a broader epistemological approach. And that's just universal epistemological skepticism, sometimes called cosmic skepticism. That's the phrase I'm going to use for now. Cosmic skepticism, which means you doubt everything. You don't believe everything. Now, just like doubting all statements will protect one from believing false statements, it unfortunately also prevents one from believing true statements. So cosmic skepticism, it's good. You won't believe anything false, but you also won't believe anything true. The other extreme, believing all statements, will result in believing all true statements. Oh, good. But alas, also, it will result in you believing all false statements. Again, either extreme is not helpful here. Discernment and critical thinking using evidence and argument is usually necessary, appropriate, helpful to sort out true and false beliefs. And this idea of reason, actually, I've argued it in previous times together here, Kirk, that this has its roots in Christianity. During the alleged Dark Ages, reason was progressing in contrast to the pagan religions who really could care less about reason. Now, I need to throw in one little exception here. So we're getting into epistemology a bit more here, but I think for our listeners and viewers, I think this is still helpful. There can be an exception to what I'm saying here about you must have evidence to support your views. An exception could be when one has a direct and immediate experience of something, like the direct and immediate experience of perceiving a tree in my backyard. Now, that experience of perceiving a tree should be considered true and rational, but not indubitable. If a defeater was to come up to be presented that, hey, there's evidence that perception is actually just a hologram, Michael, it's not actually a tree, then I should go back and review and see what is the evidence for it being a hologram, what is the evidence for it being an actual genuine perception, and so on. So I suggest that it's possible to have an direct and an immediate experience of God, which, just like the direct and immediate experience of the tree, should be considered prima facie true and rational in the absence of a defeater. It doesn't mean a defeater is impossible, and if there is a defeater presented, that would have to be analyzed. But the benefit of the doubt is given to direct and immediate experiences of things. And in the absence of a defeater to the idea that someone had a direct and immediate experience of God, that should be taken as prima facie true. So, cosmic universal knowledge skepticism is a poor and even a dangerous epistemological strategy. And that is, in effect, what I think the Enlightenment thinkers did. Both cosmic knowledge skepticism and anti-supernaturalism throw the baby out with the bathwater in their zeal to avoid dangerous false beliefs, an understandable zeal. And so, just like a broken clock is right twice a day, so too cosmic skepticism and anti-supernaturalism can get some things right. The problem is that at the same time, they provide precedents to get many more things and many more valuable things wrong in the future. So just before I ask you to jump in here, let's just summarize. So seeing witchcraft, sorcery, and magic as contrary to God's desires and commands for human beings is one thing, but violence against practitioners is another. And under the theocracy of Israel, God commanded death to sorcerers. In the New Covenant, in the New Testament theology, though, they are listed as actions that can keep one out of heaven. And there's no justification for violence against practitioners found. Therefore, witch trials, torture, and executions are not justified by the teachings of Jesus and the apostles.
Michael, I can see that often people fail to make a distinction between what Christians did and what Jesus taught, and we've pretty much beat that to death here over this series. But it's something we really do need to ask. But you've just raised a relatively new point here, and that is the distinction between how these things were handled in the Old Testament. And Old Testament, that's what we call it in English. It's really referred to in the Bible as the Old Covenant, the Old Agreement that God made with Israel, which was essentially a theocracy. But at some point, we see that they wanted a monarchy. Instead, they wanted a human government. And God says, okay, you can have that. By the time they get to the New Testament, we see a distinction in roles. At least you're getting my perspective here. It's up for discussion, but the role of a follower of Jesus Christ is primarily to represent God in this world and to tell people about Jesus Christ and what he has done with regard to eternal salvation and forgiveness. That's the role of the follower of Jesus Christ. But then in the New Testament, you also see there's a role of the government. And keep in mind, when the New Testament was written, it was the Roman government or Roman hierarchy. They might have put a Jewish leader in power in Israel, but he was really part of the Roman government. And he says the Roman government not the Roman government, but I'm thinking of Romans, the book of Romans, chapter 13. It's their job now to exercise law and order. And the people who represent Jesus Christ and follow Christ, it's their job to focus on eternal matters and invite people to consider becoming a member of the kingdom of God, a follower of Jesus Christ, eternal life, and so forth. If I, as a Christian, I'm also trying to punish people for this, that, and the other thing, I'm burning a lot of bridges. Now, you may have Christians in government, and that's a specific different situation that they're in there than but it's not a theocracy, and it almost never is. Pretty much never is a theocracy nowadays. It always gets corrupted by human nature. So I think I just want to make it really clear that it's not the Christian's job to be maintaining law and order as the directive of Jesus, as a follower of Jesus Christ, unless I am also part of the government or law enforcement, but that's their job. As a Christian, I want to reach out to people who might be practicing witchcraft or any of the other scapegoats that have been common throughout history. And every generation has their own scapegoats. Even today, we won't not have, well, there has been a real outbreak of anti-Semitism right now, yet again, throughout history. But even if that was not the case, we still have our scapegoats, people that are looked down in our society, or even just otherism, just a family in our community, and maybe they talk different, cook different, maybe they just keep to themselves. And our job as Christians is to build bridges with them and treat people as we would want to be treated and love them as we love ourselves.
Yeah, thanks for that input. That's very helpful. So we've been discussing, blemishes on the Christian record that are usually put forward as justification for believing that Christianity is harmful to human flourishing. And in each of the blemishes that we looked at, there were four responses that seemed to apply correctly. And the first one was to admit that, yes, some bad behavior did take place. Some people were burned as witches by Christians. And that's horrible that took place. Secondly, that all of these blemishes have been exaggerated. The narrative about them that we've received for the last 250 years has been exaggerated. We saw that the exaggeration usually started actually with Protestants trying to exaggerate how bad Catholicism was. Although there were good reasons for the Reformation, Protestants gave in a temptation to engage in hyperbole and make it look as if nothing good happened in the previous 1,000 years. And then those exaggerations were later picked up on by Enlightenment atheists, and then applied to all Christians, and that has continued on to the present day. Third response we had was mitigation. If you look more carefully at the situation, there were always mitigating circumstances that, if you were honest, you'd say, boy, if that was me back in this situation, I would like to think I wouldn't have done that. But, I got to admit, maybe I could have got caught up in it too. Now, none of that justifies the behavior, but I think it makes we should be a little bit less judgmental about what people have done in the past, because we haven't walked in their exact shoes. And then fourthly, that we've emphasized time and time again, were these behaviors in line with or contrary to the teachings of Jesus? And in every case, they do not line up with the teaching of Jesus and his early followers. And therefore, if that's the case, then they do not justify the conclusion that the teachings of Jesus are harmful to human flourishing. The conclusion that some Christians did bad things can be agreed, but it doesn't follow from that the teachings of Jesus and his followers are harmful to human flourishing. It just means many Christians have done a very poor job at following the teachings of Jesus. And it's the teachings of Jesus that we want our contemporaries to look at and to reconsider. Especially now, I would say, please reconsider. You are sawing off the branch you are sitting on in our liberal democratic Western culture here, as many writers have been pointing to in the last 5 to 8 years. This is just a theme that is coming out, and not just from Christian writers, but from people who are not believers. So the next question we want to move to, though, is, okay, well, if this is what happened with Christians, what about non-religious people in history? Do non-religious people fare any better? Well, it's actually hard to find a lot of non-religious people throughout history because most people are religious. But in the last couple hundred years, 250 years or so, we can begin to see large pockets of non-religious people and see them gaining power, and we can begin to see what happened in those cases. And so next time we get together, we'll look at that. What about the social impact of non-religious people?
Excellent, Michael. I'm looking forward to that because, to be honest, we can't just focus on Christianity, which, in a way, it's kind of also becoming a bit of a scapegoat when you look at what people, how
Yeah,
people exaggerated the accusations against witches and so forth. Now you see a lot of misrepresentation against Christianity, and that the attacks on Christianity are not being made by Christians necessarily, although there is certainly in-house criticisms going on, but it's by the non-religious. It doesn't follow that all non-religious are behaving badly either. Of course, it's
right.
never one or the other. But it'll be interesting, Michael. I'll very much look forward to our next episode. That'll be episode 10, and it is how do the non-religious fare when it comes to the track record of history, especially more recently when it became when more non-religious people became a larger portion of populations.
All right. Thanks, Kirk.
Thank you, Michael. I'll see you next episode. Bye for now.
Bye.